Let's continue into the red brushes. These are kind of grouped together in that they sort of average the vertices on the surface. They kind of affect the geometry that's already there, at least loosely speaking. Let's take the first brush, for example, smooth. This might be the most used brush by a long shot, if I'm honest, but not as a primary brush. It's a secondary brush that supports probably all of your other sculpting strokes. And so it gets its own hotkey with shift. And it's a special hotkey because if you hold shift, if we go to a different brush, for example, and hold shift, it becomes the smooth brush. Now, nothing changes on the screen, but holding shift, you'll see that it does smooth out the verts. And so all we're doing here, if we look from the side and redo that, right? We had the hump before and then it smooths out. Now, it does depend on how big that hump is. So if we try and smooth this one, it'll be difficult to get it completely flat again because, it's taking the verts and kind of averaging them out. But you will, for almost every stroke you make, you will end up using the smooth brush shortly after that. So that is the Shift hotkey. You'll definitely want to remember that. It also has its own dedicated hotkey, which is kind of funny, which is the S key. However, I will say that in my experience, I almost never switch to the smooth brush explicitly. The only reason I will is if the default strength is a little too high. So for example, if I try and smooth this shape out, that could be just too much of an effect for my taste given the situation. And so maybe I'll switch over to the smooth brush, go down to like 0.3 strength, and then whenever I hold shift with any other brush, it's just a softer effect. And so that is smooth. Again, probably the most used brush, but in a secondary sense, not a primary sense. And next we have the flatten brush. I'm going to flatten this corner here. All right. Now, if we look from the side, we have a semi-flat angle. Let's undo that. So we're taking the peak of the corner edge, and we're raising up the areas around it. And in the middle, we're lowering it. So we're kind of raising up the peaks. And then in the middle, we're taking it down. And so this creates an averaged semi-flat plane within the brush stroke. And so that's the behavior. But when we're practically using it, it's kind of an interesting brush. Like it has its place, but it's very mushy. It's reminiscent of that clay, what was it? The clay brush a little bit. When I read flatten, I've always expected it to be, very friendly to hard surface sculpting, and it's creating all these facets, but it's much more mushy brush than that. Now, it does have its place, but I don't use it that often. There's another brush down here, which is more useful. Next, we have the fill brush. So if we find like a divot, let's just actually make a new divot with the draw brush. Hold Control and push it down. So the fill brush will detect the low area and start to fill it up as if you're filling it with water. All right, so if we look down here at an angle, you can see what that's doing. It's smart enough to detect the higher areas and leave those as is and just fill the lower areas up to match it. Now, if we undo that and hit Control, hold Control while we stroke, you'll see that it's actually taking the surrounding areas and lowering them to the lowest elevation under our brush stroke. I don't use that too often, but it's nice to have that inverse behavior. Now, the scrape brush, this is honestly what I expected the flatten brush to be when I first got into Blender. And so this creates much flatter scraping behavior. I think it's very well named. So we can easily start to create this faceted type shape. And what's left over is much more flat. So it's not raising any areas around it if we undo. It's simply scraping away that extra material. Very similar to if you've ever sculpted with real clay, the scrape tool. It's the same kind of thing. Now, out of the box, it's very useful for hard surface sculpting, but it's also quite dependent on the shape underneath. It respects those shapes, generally speaking. And so I'm not going to be able to make substantial changes to the surface out of the box. And by substantial changes, if you think about sculpting or really carving styrofoam, on movie sets, they use this to create rock faces. And the scrape brush with a few additional settings can behave that way as well. And so this is where we kind of unlock some of these, secret, not used that often settings. So in the brush menu, towards the bottom, we have this sculpt plane and original, normal, and plane setting. And so the area plane, it seeks the surface normal underneath our brush and adopts that while we make our stroke. But you'll see that it does change dynamically, as we scrape across the surface. And so if we undo that and we enable original normal and original plane, it's not going to dynamically update. It's going to pick the original plane and sculpt entirely from that plane. All right, so to explain this maybe a little better in 3D space, what that stroke just did, if we add a mesh plane and we enable face snapping with align rotation to target, G to move it, hold control. All right, so what that brush is doing is it defined this plane and it will cut away any material beyond that plane. So if we kept that going, we could eliminate all of this material we see poking through the plane. And this can be extremely powerful if we go back to sculpt mode for being able to kind of chunk away large sections of the surface. And eventually, where this is extremely useful, is creating rocky surfaces. And so area plane is good for that, but there's another option. If we change our sculpt plane to view plane, this no longer sources the plane orientation from the surface normal. It simply defines the plane as how we're looking at the object. And so when we sculpt on the surface, this plane that we just created is perpendicular to our viewport camera. All right, so it's how we're looking directly at the surface. And so if we click on the middle of the object, we can plane large sections away. But if we click towards the outside, you'll see massive changes that we can make. All right, and so if we get in this workflow of always kind of orbiting around our surface and cutting away chunks, we can create a very rocky-like surface. Also, it would make sense, to avoid these smooth fall-offs, to change our fall-off to maybe sphere, if not constant. Let's try sphere first. That'll be a little bit more subtle. And then we'll get less of that smooth fall-off, and now we get this kind of chunky, rocky type surface. And so anyway, this isn't a rock sculpting lesson, but this brush is extremely powerful by just changing a few settings, and certainly rocky surfaces, it's used all the time. I love the scrape brush. I use it a lot. The last red brush is the multi-plane scrape. And so this one is a little bit harder to tell what it does just outside of the box. It creates these peaks, but at a pretty high cost, given what happens surrounding the stroke. And so I don't use this brush a lot, but where I think it's most useful, and probably what it was designed for, is if we were to create like a square or cube corner off of this rounded shape. I'm going to take the draw sharp and kind of pull out a corner here along with 3 edges. So just imagine like this is the corner of a cube, like trying to bust out of this sphere. All right, so we've kind of created, also looks like the front of a ship, for example. So if we use the multi-plane brush to reinforce these edges, then overall it will, and then maybe smooth in between, it will make those edges much more prominent as they should be. And so, a very specific use case for this brush, certainly for hard surface sculpting, but not one that I use regularly. And that's all for the red brushes. Let's get into the yellow brushes next.